Welcome to this stream from Windows on the World. I can hardly keep up with the information myself that I've been looking into and putting out, so I don't expect everybody else to. But the archive is huge and the things that we've covered have been extensive. And tonight we're going to take a deep dive into looking at collectivism and the way people are collectivized into cults. Especially, we're going to be talking about those that were related to and known as co-Freemasonry, such as the Theosophical Society and the lesser known Stella Matutina. And we're going to use these as examples of how people are steered. I'm going to be quoting from a book called The Light Bearers of Darkness, written by Christina Stoddard and known as the Enquire Within series. And this was actually published in 1930. It's related to the other books that we've actually studied regarding Theosophy, Freemasonry, secret societies, the Martinists, Ellis Cohen, all of these groups which were outside the official branch of Freemasonry, but were particularly active during revolutionary periods. And that's the key. So we're going to be looking into these organizations tonight, the world of Kabbalah, Freemasonry, Luciferianism, and some say Satanism, because in essence, that's what a lot of this stuff is really about. It's putting yourself alongside or above God, which is the Kabbalah. And we're going to be talking about that because if you look at the most revered Kabbalistic document, the Zohar, written in the 1200s, but reputed to be from nearly 1,000 years earlier. It was actually written by Moses de Leon, Simeon ben Yochai, and his alias was Moses de Leon. And he wrote this, and it's basically a disjointed and fragmented view of the world, in my opinion, because it takes things that may be referred to in the Bible and it puts them into this materialistic, atheistic kind of system called Kabbalah. And for instance, the belief within the Zohar is that God was split up into 10 different parts, and it's up to us, his creation, to reassemble him or her or it, whatever you want to define as God, the all-encompassing governance, which one can access through divine providence, but certainly not through low magic and ritual. And that's where everything seemed to go wrong for people who were in the Reformation in Britain in the 15 to 1600s. This influence of Kabbalah and the numerology, the tarot, the esotericism, all of it that came along with divination and this channeling of lower entities or demons was a big part of what went wrong in Britain's early adventures into esotericism and mysticism. And we've covered that in so many different shows. So we're going to really be talking about what is known as Illuminism, the secret societies, which are merely steering mechanisms. They dupe people, people take terrible oaths, and then they can't get out of it. And that is ungodly, and it's against all natural law. So that's the system which drives and has driven world governance for quite a long time. We've covered this in many different aspects. We've talked about Louis Claude de Saint Martin, who walked away from the Martinism, which was this theurgical branch of Freemasonry. He actually did not put himself in any danger. He wrote a very kind and considerate letter to the lodge and disappeared from it. And that is really what any wise person would do, because when you compromise part of yourself, you're completely compromised. It's like being trapped in an abusive relationship, really. So what happens is that you go back to the abuser for some kind of remedy. And that's really what happened in these secret societies. And a lot of the time they were arguing amongst each other over trifles that meant nothing. Meanwhile, the people who were steering it all from behind actually used this surface distraction for exactly what it was, surface distraction. So the initiate becomes a vessel of something he actually knows nothing about, and it keeps them on the hamster wheel, going through different grades through the lodge. And the rituals can become quite absurd because a lot of them have been leaked. And well, you can look at Morgan's Freemasonry, Captain Morgan. He actually reprinted all of the degrees of Freemasonry, and he was murdered for it. But none of this stuff really means anything. It's just surface ritual and pretty much a load of nonsense. So the promise is the ability of man to become as God or to be alongside God. The result, though, is that the initiate is trapped in egregorial mind traps. In other words, they get trapped into the energy of the particular lodge or movement, and nothing new comes into it. It becomes stagnant. There's a strong and unbendable belief system. And when that collides within these organizations, there's a huge argument and they all start putting spells on each other, and it just gets really silly. You can look what happened between McGregor Mathers, people like Crowley. Crowley was just really exhibitionist, very spoilt person, inherited a fortune, wasted it, did nothing useful on the planet, and everything he did failed, and everyone around him who was connected to with him suffered. His wife ended up in an insane asylum. He walked away from his best friend who died on the side of a mountain. He was a useful idiot of the intelligence services and a big part of the degradation of people's minds, which disempowers them, of course. So Crowley was really all about disempowerment. That was what he was there for: disempowerment, disillusion, failure. And his life was all of that. So yes, through ritual and instruction, there's no connection to real divinity. So this is the Luciferian neurosis, or Kabbalah. The Kabbalah works in exactly the same way, trying to put oneself alongside God. And there's even a Talmudic story, which if we have time, we'll get into, which starts off talking about baking and ovens, and it ends up with the rabbi winning an argument with God. This is entirely missing the point, and it's bringing everything down to this materialistic, fake, logical viewpoint of the world, which is egregorial, traps these people and neuters them. So this is a very important point, and it's something we talked about in the Perfected Minefield, true providence. It's very difficult to actually keep that open, because what tends to happen is that people get dragged off into these egregorial groups, and it's very difficult to stay out of them. I mean, I've been talking about this communitarian system, which was put in by the World Revolutionary Movement in 2010. To this day, nobody's really taken it seriously or deconstructed this very simple template, which applies to so much of public life. And the same with secret societies. So yes, going against natural processes on Earth is not a good idea and never works. So basically, people go in favor of subverting the natural law through their so-called willpower. So no personal development is gained from these groups. I've been studying this for such a long time. I was fascinated by it when I was younger. I've looked into everything I can, and at the end of it, you realize that this was a massive mind trap. In the Protocols of World Revolution, which are the governing document for life on Earth, and some people say it's a fake, some people say it's a forgery. If it's a forgery, then what was it a forgery of? It must be an exact copy of the original. A forgery is an exact copy of the original. So what's the problem? It's like getting a photocopy of it, then saying it's not the original. It doesn't really matter because the content's the same. So this is what it says in the Protocols of World Revolution, which appeared in the early 1900s, probably written in the late 1800s, and came out of the first Zionist conference in Basel, Switzerland. But it doesn't really matter, because this is a governing document. That's all it is. It says who or what can dethrone an invisible power. That's the key. When I'm talking about these systems like communitarianism that run global to local government, they are invisible to the public, but they're fully visible. The public just don't put together how the thing works. And that is the same with all political process, because people will still keep voting. They'll blame Starmer. They'll go back to the Tories. They'll bring in Farage, Reform, or whatever these puppet parties are. They're all under the same thumb, and they're all bought out, and they tell you that they're bought out by a third party. So in other words, unless people vote for people who've taken a real stand and a promise to put their own country first, their national sovereignty first, then you're just wasting your time even considering them. So yeah, that's interesting. Actually, there's a fellow from this Palestine News Network, and he goes to all of these Congress people in America, and he asks them a simple question. He says, Israel first or America first? And 99% of them walk away and will not answer him. The amount of people that say America first are about 1%. So that tells you everything you need to know about how people are hoodwinked, compromised, and bought out. So who or what can dethrone an invisible power, said the Illuminists. This is just what our government is. The Masonic Lodge, the esoteric side throughout the world, unconsciously acts as a mask for our purpose. The real versus the stated goals. The idiots in these organizations become useful idiots because they do not know the real goals behind what they're doing. They're thrown a few little tidbits of information which don't mean anything and will not advance them in any way, and keep them disempowered, which is what this whole secret society structure was all about. It says, but the use we are going to make of this power in our plan of action and even our headquarters remain perpetually unknown to the world at large, which is, of course, what the Rosicrucians were trying to say. Their temple where Father R.C. was meant to be buried was a secret. Everything about it was nonsense. It was all made up garbage, but it hooks people into what they love, a bit of mystery, a carrot on a stick. So hence surface occultism and mystery. Yes, the real versus the stated goals, religions and their egregors. So egregorial groups are formed by the fake priesthood. So the priesthood in front of all organized religion are fake. They would not be allowed to be there if they were conveying any real information or empowering people. So the organized religions disempower their congregations. And that's what the fake Christian church in Britain has always done. The real Christian church, however, was feared because it had an indomitable spirit and a force which these people who wanted to oppose it absolutely feared, because it was natural law, the Holy Spirit. And that's what all of these groups never take into consideration. Even though some of them talk of Holy Spirit, they will put it along the soul of Christ, the bodhisattva. They'll bring in all of these systems which were just there to control people under what is essentially a global caste system. So those who are entrapped by these secret and subversive societies enter, of course, with high ideals, seeking spiritual development for themselves and others, the result being often a fanatical obsession, perverting all that is high and sacred. Invariably, the higher the ideals, the greater the blind acceptance of their master's call to take part in their diabolical work of destruction. And I'm quoting now from Inquire Within, 1930, written by Christina Stoddard. And this is all about the secret societies which entrap people. It carries on. Further, it is interesting to find that the oath of secrecy and silence demanded from the candidate and adept is always in connection with the astral methods of contacting these masters and the real aims and work of the order as directed by them in this mysterious secrecy and silence. There's this big focus with these esotericists on contacting beings on the astral plane, of course, from Blavatsky to Annie Besant to Alice Bailey and the modern ones, of course. They all do this. But where does the information come from? The information comes usually, I would suspect, and in my own experience, from the lower astral plane, which is either just garbage, time-wasting entities, or even demonic. So this is a big thing with the type of theurgical Freemasonry that was practiced by the Ellis Cohen, the Martinists, and the offshoots of the Theosophical Society, the Stella Matutina, not tuna. So we're going to get into all that. Yes, in the Theosophist now, I'm going to give you some good quotes to get going. In the Theosophist, October 1928, it is said, if you see any one of us working for any particular movement in the world, you may know it is part of the world plan. In other words, these are the words of the World Revolutionary Movement who control it all. And the great plan is, this is what they say, a new heaven and a new earth, built upon the ruins of old established systems and civilizations. Well, that didn't turn out too well, did it? So if what we have now, the plunder by a so-called global elite and a control system which is put in out of complete fear and paranoia, then that is not a governing system. That's a failed governing system. So this new heaven and new earth they're talking about is a complete failure. And they're talking about building it upon the ruins of all old established systems and civilizations. Well, how arrogant can you get? That is definitely the fault of a Luciferian mindset. In other words, the arrogance is what comes before a massive fall. And we can see that happening in the Middle East right now, in the modern day state of Israel. So if you don't want to be a dummy, don't dumb down. I just came up with that. I was being interviewed in some podcast the other day, which was really focusing on stuff that was very, very out of date in my mind. But as I say, there's a certain amount of personal responsibility with knowledge, isn't there? That you have to take complete ownership of what comes out of your mind into your mouth. And if you can't do that, then you are under the influence of something. And that's a very important point, because if you are in the moment with divine providence, the right stuff should just happen in real time. And that's just called providence. So you can't really manufacture that through willpower. It has to be something else. It has to be an acceptance. So you can see that this Illuminist view of the world is completely upside down as to how it actually functions, which is why, of course, it's always struggling to keep control, because it's going against natural law. So it's never going to work like that. So the revolutionary movement entraps and blinds their vessels with the ancient catchwords. This is again from Inquire Within. Know thyself, and ye shall be as gods. Out of this, we get the Invisibles, the Invisible College, Rosicrucianism, Martinism, the Grand Orient Freemasonry, Scottish Rite, Theosophy, Anthroposophy, Steiner, of course, who was very much under the influence of Kabbalists, including Hayam Samuel Falk, the so-called Baal Shem Tov of London, who was said to have a perpetual menorah which never went out, and other fantasy delusions. He was meant to have been able to, he lived in Whitechapel, and he was meant to have gone all the way up to Epping Forest with only 3 wheels on his wagon, and the other one was rolling along behind under his control. This is all the sort of nonsense that people put out when they're trying to build a reputation for themselves. So yeah, mind groups reinforce their own narrow input. That's so important. How many groups have you been in that basically drive themselves apart because somebody else comes in? And it's not that somebody else has come in, it's that the group didn't have a strong central aim or a strong central foundational base. And that is what's important. So with these Illuminist societies, the people on the outer side of them, the initiates, in other words, the useful idiots and the dupes who were put out front, they didn't have the same vision as the people inside the organization who were driving them to carry out actions. So that is a very good analogy as to how society functions at the moment. And it's something to learn, because I found that really helpful when I looked at the failure of these societies and the people within them. I met a lot of occultists over the years, and they were always very argumentative with each other and so full of themselves, but they entirely missed the point that real acceptance brings divine providence, but it takes a lot of what they would call inner work, which is just normal. It's a normal way of advancing. So all groups are covered. If the person is under control, they don't know the real versus the stated goals. So they're always carrying out the stated goals. It's a little bit like people in government, works the same way. So the solution, of course, is to act entirely in providence. And that's much more easier said than done. And I found that the lectures on egregorial groups and the ideas of the late Konstantin Petrov, very, very useful for this. Very clear thinking, very simply laid out. And there's many speakers who were associated with him. And the level of intellect is far higher than anything I've heard come out of the West, which is quite disturbing when you think about it. So we're going to be talking about the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which was founded in 1888 by William Wynne Westcott, Samuel Liddell MacGregor Mathers, and William Robert Woodman. And all of these were Freemasons to start with. But by the early 1900s, revolts had started over Mather's autocratic leadership, says the internet. Well, the German branches of occult societies went so much against MacGregor Mathers that they were told if he had anything to do with any information, they were to refute it. So they were always fighting amongst each other, these people. So there was 3 lodges that came out of this, really. And there was the Alpha and Omega Lodge, led by MacGregor Mathers. And that was for keeping the original Theosophists in the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn and into Theosophy. The Independent and Rectified Right was led by A.E. Waite, who is not a bad author, but he tends to dribble on pointlessly with, allegorical waffling is the best way to put it. But some of his information is quite good because he was, to some degree, and it is in degrees, was an insider. But he abandoned ceremonial magic in favor of Christian mysticism, which again waters down the whole thing. So Christian mysticism is not the way. It's Kabbalah. It's mixed with Kabbalah again, which is a totally flawed concept. Remember that in Kabbalah, the God has been split into 10 parts, and it's up to very clever dick people on earth to put him back together again. It's ridiculous. It's a ridiculous concept, and it comes from a fractured and disturbed mind, out of touch with all reality. And that's what happened to these people, in my opinion. Then, of course, we've got the Stella Matutina, which was led by Robert William Felkin. I've been reading a lot of stuff about this. It chose to actively continue the original magical traditions of the Golden Dawn. So there's a lot said about this stuff, and a lot of it is just legend, which was created around it. But when you go to the core of it, what did it actually achieve, apart from bringing over Eastern ideas from India, particularly because they were obsessed with that, especially Annie Besant, Alice Bailey, and Blavatsky, of course, because she was meant to have gone to Tibet, and there's no evidence she actually did. She channeled the Tibetan. Interestingly, Tibet was a place of strong serpent black magic. And that's a really interesting thing that's overlooked by a lot of people in the West, that according to the information I've been looking at over the years, and I've looked at tons of stuff. But so, yeah, this Robert Felkin, I've been reading about him today. A medical missionary and explorer established the Stella Matutina's primary outer order temple as the Amun Temple in London. They were obsessed with ancient Egypt. Well, ancient Egypt was crowd control. It was the pharaohs, the poster boys, but the real priesthood behind them were just good at controlling people. This is basically what these people miss. And a lot of the actual rituals for this Stella Matutina were based on the Egyptian Book of the Dead, this Isis, Osiris, Horus stuff, which it's just, again, it's analogous to lots of other stuff. But what's the point of it? What's the point of those stories? They're okay to listen to, I suppose. But once you've heard one, and then the variations of them, what do you learn from it? Nothing. You don't learn anything from it. I've never learned anything from Isis, Osiris, Horus, the story of that. What do you learn from it? Nothing. They'll say, oh, it's an allegory and you have to decode it. Yeah, you can waste your time, but the truth is always simple, isn't it? So it says Felkin was highly interested in astral travel, spiritualism, and divine communication. Well, what does any of that mean? Astral travel. Well, unless you're having a focused out-of-body experience, astral travel can mean anything. It can mean that you're just out there at the mercy of a load of nonsense. Spiritualism, same thing. It's all about channeling and receiving information. But where does the information come from? Is the information any good? And that's the key. Is it divine inspiration, or is it just stuff that comes into your head from these lower dimensional entities? And a lot of this seems to be from that, because all of these people seem to have fallen out, argued amongst each other, and basically achieved nothing except put out lots of legends and stories. So, and then he says divine communication. Well, these are all woolly terms in this esoteric world because they're not defining what that actually means. He claimed to receive psychic directives from secret chiefs. This is how they sort of inflate their egos and make themselves feel good. The secret chiefs are talking to me. Or the sun masters via automatic writing to guide the order. Well, automatic writing is just leaving yourself open to any garbage that's out there. Sometimes it might make sense. Sometimes it might sound profound, but it's not as useful as the people who are behind this having a plan and directing these people to carry out that plan. That's actually practical and will work. So the more and more I looked into it, and the more and more I've read about this Stella Matutina and the Golden Dawn Theosophical Society, was what a farce it all really was. And it did a lot of damage as well. It damaged a lot of people because they were genuinely looking for information. And I think to a certain extent, these occult organizations, that there is information to be had, but what is the purpose of it? All information needs a purpose. So yes, so it sounds like egregorial channeling of lower dimensional entities. The Stella Matutina retained the classic Golden Dawn curriculum based on the Hermetic Kabbalah, tarot divination, astrology, geomancy, and Enochian magic. While meanwhile, the people behind them were busy infiltrating every organization, every royal family. They were running the banks. They were staging revolutions. They were changing the world. The people who were in these organizations and being the useful idiots were actually achieving nothing, possibly driving themselves half insane and arguing with each other. So that, I think, was the original idea of all of it. So the Stella Matutina expanded internationally when Dr. Felkin moved to New Zealand, founding the prominent Wa Ra Temple. It's also called the Smaragdum Thalassies. So they love all of this flowery language and inventing rituals. And it does appeal to a certain type of mind, and I can understand why it does. But this was a very exploratory time, and it came at the time which was the end of the Reformation, nearly, towards the end of the Reformation, because the reformists, the Protestants, were very, very tied in with Kabbalah through Europe, through the European side of things. And this Kabbalah, which had come out of the Languedoc in the 1200s and seemed to infest Britain. So it just threw things everywhere. And any of the real Christian power would have been completely usurped by it and fragmented, which it seems was the purpose. The Wa Ra Temple became one of the longest running authentic temples operating out of a purpose-built structure until the late 1970s. The order's secrecy was permanently altered by Israel Regardie. Now, I read a book by him years ago. It's called Crowley's Apprentice. It's got the tetragrammaton and all the usual garbage that leads you nowhere that they use in magic rituals. And interestingly, I knew somebody, he was just a bus driver who lived in North London in Muswell Hill, and he went to a party. Israel Regardie was there with a load of other occultists, quite well-known ones. And he said, yeah, they were all arguing amongst each other. A couple of them were, I don't think Regardie was an alcoholic, but a very famous one was, chronic alcoholic. And he said it got very dark, the things that they were talking about. And they were basically talking about taking people down by putting spells on them. I'm not saying Regardie was, but he called himself Crowley's apprentice. Who would be Alistair Crowley's apprentice? What sort of mug would be an apprentice of Crowley? That's just ridiculous. But Regardie joined the Stella Matutina's Hermes Temple in Bristol in 1933, believing that the group was dying out and that its profound spiritual systems shouldn't be lost to history. Maybe it'd be better if they were. Regardie broke his oaths of secrecy. Between 1937 and 1940, he published the Order's Inner Core Knowledge, Rituals and Lectures in his landmark multi-volume compendium of what? You decide. Virtually all contemporary Western occultism, Wicca, and neo-paganism that utilize Golden Dawn frameworks rely heavily on the Stella Matutina documents published by Regardie. So that's what the internet says about it. The book Enquire Within gives you the whole history, published in 1930. And I've been going through it. And what comes across so much is the pointlessness and the misdirection and lack of direction of the people involved in it. So the Stella Matutina means morning star, of course, was an initiatory magical order dedicated to dissemination of the traditional occult teachings. The Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, where we've been through that, Theosophical Society, Masonry, Rosicrucians, all arguing among themselves over matters of no real importance. Practically, the Masonic lodges became very active political agencies, whereas the Rosicrucian branches were more secret in their operations, and it was and is an absolute rule that no one should confess to being a Rosicrucian. So they had it all covered, really. Your normal businessmen, people in the town who wanted to get on would join the Freemasons. The people who were maybe a little bit more under the surface would be fascinated by Rosicrucianism. And they were all steering mechanisms, of course, because Father RC, with his fantastic story of going to Fez in Morocco and meeting these Arab teachers and learning all this stuff. I mean, it's a ridiculous story. And that was the Farmer Fraternitatis that came out in 1610, I think. But by 1614, I think the other documents had come out. There's the Confessio, and there's, of course, the Alchemical Wedding by Valentine Andre, which is another... It's just like a test where they're in this house and they go through different layers of realization, usual stuff, really. Quite cleverly written. I mean, the thing about some of this stuff is it is and was very well written. These people had very brilliant minds, but they were being steered away from what was actually happening underneath it all. This is by a Baron C.A.W. who wanted to keep his identity a little bit quiet. This is again from the same volume, Enquire Within 1930 by Christina Stoddard. In England, the few members of the Continental Order are all Theosophists, or members of the Theosophical Society. They are none of them members of the English Freemasons. Well, that's apart from the people who are in the background, like Mathers, of course. They see things from the Theosophical Society point of view, and they have to use their spectacles. I am the only member of the Continental Order who is not and has never been a member of the Theosophical Society. I owe no allegiance to Annie Besant. I am, as the doctor knows, and that's Dr. Felkin, entirely with him in the policy of abandoning Oriental and Indian for European or Kabbalistic training. What could possibly go wrong? That's like jumping out the frying pan into the fire, isn't it? I'm also an English Freemason, so that I can give him the point of view of the other parties. It carries on. English occultism is roughly divided into one, members of the Theosophical Society, Mrs. Besant's followers headed by the co-masons in one sense. Now, Annie Besant always talked about co-masonry because the Theosophists weren't Freemasons, apart from the people who set it up, of course, like we've mentioned, McGregor Mathers and Westcott. But the people in the normal day-to-day workings of this group were not actually Freemasons. Most of them weren't. But Annie Besant talks constantly about co-masonry. And she had the same worldview as Alice Bailey and, of course, Blavatsky. They all wanted world government, and they all thought it was going to be done through Freemasonry. So, 2, he says, members of the Hermetic Orders and Freemasons. This is the second bunch. And 3 is independents, whether in small groups or individuals, which you meet a lot of. You meet a lot of those sort of people still, I think. English Masonry boasts the Grand Lodge of 1717, the Mother Lodge of the world. They are a proud, jealous, autocratic body. Co-Masonry derives from the Grand Orient of France, an illegitimate body according to English ruling. So the way that the Grand Orient, Kabbalistic Freemasonry, came into Britain was through these societies and through Masons, Freemasons. So the Grand Orient and the Scottish Rite combined. The York Rite stayed outside of it. So the York Rite was not Kabbalistic. The Scottish Rite is entirely Kabbalistic. It says no English Mason can work with co-Masons. So if people are in Freemasonry and they have taken the oath, they're not allowed to work with non-Masons. In other words, people who want to work with Freemasons. So here you can see that it's very tightly controlled structure. Now, the Masons who gave Dr. S, the mysterious Dr. S, his link, are regarded as eccentrics who invent spurious grades. Well, this is, of course, what Martinez de Pasquale did, and the Martinists and the Ellis Cohen, they invented their own grades. But none of that is important because most of this is just gobbledygook. And it's look at the Scottish Rite, you know, Knight Kadosh and all this stuff. It's all Kabbalistic. It says Martinists and Ellis Cohen played a part, of course, in the French Revolution. This is what they miss. So, in other words, the organizations that these people became a part of, these Kabbalistic organizations, were run by the World Revolutionary Movement. Very simple to decode that. It says if the English Grand Lodge hears of anything called esoteric masonry derived from such sources, it will simply say, no English Masons of the free and accepted Masons may join any society working pseudo-Masonic rites. So it keeps them all at each other's throats, which of course is the idea. That's how you control people, i.e. no one of the ordinary accepted Freemasonry can attend any meetings or take any grade in this illegitimate body. Fini. That's the end. You can't. Well, it's kind of all missing the point of what the Illuminists were about, isn't it? Recruiting through dreadful oaths and forming governing groups in different countries. That's what happened. Let us show the inner and outer workings using the dupes to argue over ritual and pageantry. The failure of Theosophy, Anthroposophy, and the Stella Matutina really is a good example here. So Blavatsky, Annie Besant, Alice Bailey, McGregor Mathers, Crowley, and of course Krishnamurti, who walked away from it all. And this was this fascination that they had with India. They had this fascination with governing systems in India and Indian mysticism, which they channeled into what became Krishnamurti, and he just walked away from it all. He just walked away. So yes, this book is called Light Bearers of Darkness, Inquire Within 1930, Light Bearers of Darkness. Carries on, it was about 1597 that the Masons separated themselves entirely from the Rosicrucians and decided to modify their procedures, and they refused in future to admit women to their ceremonies. Well, I think they all work together on a much higher level than that, because you can see a lot of Kabbalistic and Rosicrucian symbolism in the City of London. So that says it all. Who runs the City of London? Well, there you go. This was partly due, it says, to political circumstances, as both Masons and Rosicrucians tried to influence the political development of the nations amongst whom they lived and worked. Well, of course, that's their only tangible goal, isn't it? It says, practically, the Masonic lodges became very active political agencies, whereas the Rosicrucian branches were more secret in their operations. So spies were recruited into the Rosicrucians because they like working undercover. That's the way it seems to me. And it was and is an absolute rule that no one should confess to being a Rosicrucian. It's funny, isn't it? Because you meet people go, I'm a Rosicrucian. Well, what exactly does that mean? I've read the documents, but what does it mean? And it's a form of what they call mystical Christianity, using Christian symbolism, but with Kabbalah. Well, that's not Christianity. It's kind of the opposite, you know. So strict was it that this Rosicrucian, so the Rosicrucians who even knew one another were not allowed to speak or discuss matters connected with their society within the confines of a city or town. These are the ideal spies, of course. These are the ideal infiltrators. So they turn up in a town. There's a few of them there. They know who they are. They meet up. No one's any the wiser, and they get on with the work they've got to do. Spies. A big fuss around the mystery of the organization, and a fantastical cover story in the founding documents, of course. The Forma Fraternitatis, the Confessio, the chemical wedding. Word mystery. Word mystery. Real versus the stated goals are the only thing of any importance, of course. It says, and their agents, of course, is what I put, lie about their powers and make themselves as gods in their own minds. So again, it comes back to egregorial collective action. Delusion, anti-nature equals wrong action. And this is so true. I've known a lot of occultists over the years because I was interested in finding out what they believed in. I found out that what they did didn't work. Their lives were not a success in any way. I'm not talking about materially. I'm talking about philosophically. Philosophically not successful, the ones I met. And it's quite funny in a way, because I used to know this fella who was really into all this stuff, and I had a very interesting library. But we had an argument one night. I'd argued with him over something, and he sent a bloody demon to my house. I saw it there, you know. And I thought, well, if that's what these people are, they have a problem. They definitely have a problem. And I found that with a lot of these sort of people. And that fella who went to that party where there was occultists told me the same thing. So there's once you get this kind of ego and this attachment to ritual and oaths, you've got real problems, because people aren't working naturally with a natural order of things. So collectivism is often a really bad idea, but individuals working together collectively for an intended outcome is usually quite successful, because they put aside their differences. And a lot of these organizations, they couldn't put aside their differences because they were focusing on what was in effect trivia. So Illuminism, or so-called liberation of man, free not to use his freedom for himself, but to fulfill the plans of the great conspiracy and its supreme pontiff. That was from Inquire Within again. I'll just read it out. I think I need a bit of coffee. Illuminism, or so-called liberation of man, free not to use his freedom for himself, but to fulfill the plans of the great conspiracy and its supreme pontiff. They're not talking about the Pope, they're talking about a general Pope. This is, of course, the messianic cult leader, the Maitreya, what's going to appear, the soul of Christ, the new Buddha. This is where I think the steering mechanism to steer them into nowhere was at its most powerful. So hence the asking the universe, of course, and not God. Maitreya, waiting for the Messiah, all there in Buddhism, Hinduism, Judaism. Isms were created for control, of course. Communism, communitarianism, fascism, anarchism. You see, the thing is about this is that the real versus the stated goals comes in again. It's like people who will endlessly talk about the theories of Karl Marx in the UK, entitled middle-class professors, thinking it's a good idea. They don't understand the flaws of Marxism and the surplus economy and all these things, which can be easily taken apart by anybody who knows about that. But they get into philosophical arguments in pubs, and anybody who's lived under communism will tell you, well, that's not how it works. It doesn't work like that. Again, the real versus the stated goals. So methods of top-down governance masquerading under different titles. So let's go back now to the protocols of world revolution. There will burst forth one fine evening one of these formidable crises which will shake the earth and which occult societies have long prepared for Christian society. Remember, Christianity is the enemy of the Illuminists. And then perhaps will suddenly appear in open daylight throughout the entire world, all the militia, all the fraternal and unknown sects of the Kabbalah. There you go. The ignorance, the carelessness in which we live of their sinister existence, their affinities and their immense ramifications will in no way prevent them from recognizing each other, and under the banner of no matter what universal alliance, giving each other the kiss of peace, they will hasten to gather together under one chief. That's the danger. That again is from the Enquire Within volume. And the first bit, of course, was the Illuminati protocols of world revolution. So let's take this apart and look at the most recent. We can look at terror events such as 9/11 and 7/7, quite well executed. 9/11, 7/7, not so well executed, but still had the desired effect. And then we can go and look at the event in 2020, which was well planned, but badly executed. So these people are mixed up in what they're doing. It's not really working 100%. And that, I think, is because they're doing it under a false governance system. So yes, the quote there, the last one, is from the Protocols of World Revolution in the book of Gouguenot de Moisseau. And it was published in 1869, which was around the time the protocols appeared, and was immediately bought up and, save for a few odd copies, completely disappeared. And it was actually published after his mysterious death in 1886, finally circulated. So yes, originally from 1869. So he had a very good insight into the protocols of world revolution before they had actually been released in the early 1900s, because it was the Few and the Many. It came out in a book by Serge Nihilus, The Few and the Many. And of course, that was then stated to be a forgery. Forgery, again, is just like a copy of the original. So, especially with the document. So the Order of the Stella Matutina, or the Order of the Companions of the Rising Light of the Morning, the Golden Dawn in the Outer, was its actually its full name. Maybe I should have told you that at the beginning, but it's not that important. But this is the self-importance and the comedy of these people. The Order of the Companions of the Rising Light of the Morning, the Golden Dawn in the Outer. So in other words, the useful idiots on the outside love pontificating with word salad and allegorical waffle, but the people behind it are actually getting on with something. So, and this was built up from a book, and the Stella Matutina was actually a manuscript. It was found in a market by the Reverend A.F.A. Woodford in 1884 on an old bookstall in Farringdon Street, London. And they based a whole organization on this book of waffle that it looks like had been planted there by Illuminist Freemasons in Paris, part of the Grand Orient, the ones behind the French Revolution. So it says accompanying the manuscript was a letter in German saying that if anyone cared to decipher these manuscripts, they could communicate with Sapiens Dominerabitur Astris, or better known as Fraulein Anna Sprengel, living in Hanover. And it said if they contacted her, they would receive interesting information. So having deciphered the manuscript, they were then told by this woman to elaborate the rituals, which was done by MacGregor Mathers, who was a Freemason, assisted by Dr. Wynne Westcott. They were then told that if diligent, they would be permitted to form an elementary branch of the Rosicrucian order in England. Spy network in Britain. No one ever met this woman, and she died in a German village in 1893. They don't even tell you where she died. So that could be all a load of crap, but it's interesting that this fervor for esoteric information was known to the Illuminist lodges. So by them merely planting this manuscript in Britain, they could recruit useful idiots through this new organization to be a front for their Rosicrucianism, who were the spies, and they had the useful idiots out front with the egos like MacGregor Mathers and all these people who promoted the Kabbalah. They were promoting the Christian Kabbalah. So we've been through that in so many shows. I don't want to get too tied up in that, but very interesting. The book was believed to be planted by Grand Orient Illuminati Freemasons to subvert British Masonry. Apart from the oaths in the book, channeled. This is funny now. So when it comes down to it, the oaths in the book that people had to take were channeled by the wife of MacGregor Mathers. Who the hell was she in touch with to channel that? And she was the sister of author Henri Bergson, who was the author of Hidden and Secret Chiefs of the Third Order. Did the penny not drop with any of these people? Obviously not. Right, we'll get to the oath now, because this is another really bad thing that they did. It's a warning about divulging secrets or speaking out. Of course, these people wouldn't know any real secrets. They would know a certain amount, but the real secrets would, of course, be hidden from them. Anyone exposing secrets of the order would suffer. Those taking the oath were threatened thus. The candidate asking for light is taken to the altar and forced to take an obligation to secrecy under penalty of expulsion and death or palsy from hostile current of will. So in other words, the other people in the lodge would form a group, egregor, of evil intent and channel it towards the person who they thought had betrayed the lodge. So that's pretty serious stuff. And that's where divine providence and the Holy Spirit comes in. But of course, if you're in one of these organizations, you probably haven't got that protection. And that's a very important point. Lower level demonism. Let's carry on. In addition to expulsion under the awful penalty of voluntarily submitting myself to a deadly and hostile current of will set in motion by the chiefs of the order, by which I fall slain or paralyzed without visible weapon, as if blasted by a lightning flash. So in other words, you'd just drop dead. So the wife of MacGregor Mathers, what was she channeling to give her that information? Because that's completely satanic. That is like signing your life away, and with a terrible penalty if the others found you or believed you to be a liability. So yes, they had a funny side to it though, because MacGregor Mathers and his wife in 1899, they hired a theatre in Paris, and they went through the ritual of Osiris in front of probably a packed house. And the people there said it was laughable There was reports that it was laughable, apart from when the possessed wife of MacGregor Mathers got up and saved the day with the Osiris ritual, which they said was actually quite electric. So there's a bit of comedy about this. If you go back into the archive, there's a show about the Theosophists, Blavatsky and Occult, I think. And when they went to New York and their Isis and Osiris parades, and they said they were just comedy. They said they were just comedy. And those shows are in the archive. But of course, there's a serious side to all this. It's people are being steered to objectives they know very little or nothing about. The Golden Dawn became the name for the Stella Matutina. Chaim Samuel Falk was involved in the hidden and secret chiefs of the Third Order. So that's the Baal Shem Tov of London, the one who thought he was a magician, who had the perpetual menorah burning in his flat in Whitechapel. And he was visited apparently by Steiner, and he was very influential with these people. And this Christian Kabbalah was a real subversion. So it says Mathers is described as the Earl of Glenstray, otherwise Count MacGregor. See, none of these people suffered from low esteem, did they? They all suffered from high esteem. And his emissary, who was sent from Paris to take possession in Mathers' name of the London Temple and property variously known as, wait for it, E.A. Crowley, Alistair MacGregor, or Count Zverev. These people are jokers, aren't they? Alistair Crowley arrived in Highland dress to take over the Stella Matutina, a black mask over his face and a big scarf thrown over his head and shoulders, an enormous gold cross upon his breast and a dagger at his side. And he was just told to piss off, basically. He was removed and expelled. He obviously wasn't a member that they wanted. So he turned up full of himself, made a fool of himself, and got kicked out. That's basically what happened. And during this revolt, we find Mathers writing to other rebels on April the 2nd, 1900. I therefore know when the great adepts of this planet, still in the body of the flesh, the secret chiefs of our order, are with me. And I tell you plainly that were it possible to remove me from my place as visible head of our order, the which cannot be without my consent because of certain magical links, you would find nothing but disruption and trouble fall upon you all until you had expiated so severe a karma as that of opposing a current sent at the end of a century to regenerate a planet. Well, don't tell them what you're going to do. Don't tell them what you're going to do, will you? I mean, it's all front, it's all bravado, it's all bullshit. But they're playing around with low magic. So anything can happen if people aren't protected. It says, and for the first time since I have been connected with the order, I shall formulate my request to the highest chiefs for the punitive current to be prepared to be directed against those who rebel, should they consider it advisable. So they're all horrible little tyrants, really. None of them were in touch with natural law or the Holy Spirit by the sound of this. And they were all completely and utterly polluted by Kabbalistic belief system. So, yeah, they love this kind of careless threat, the oaths, the rituals, the bad magic. It was a big part of the stuff that went into the press about this time. Crowley, of course, was a big part of that, and this battle of the wills. But they're all taking substances, a lot of them. A lot of them were out of their minds, and anything can happen. People can get rid. In fact, I'm surprised more of them didn't become completely full-on demonically possessed, or maybe they did. But they were playing around with stuff they definitely didn't understand if they were believing in this Kabbalistic world. And on May 28th, 1902, we found Dr. Felkin saying, we beg to assure you that we are in entire sympathy with the view that if, in fact, the order is without the guidance and inspiration of higher intelligences, its rationale is gone. Well, what higher intelligences did he think he was in touch with? He doesn't actually say, he just calls them the secret chiefs. It occurred to certain members that it might be possible, by reverting to the original constitution, to re-establish a link with the Third Order. So there was all this internal fighting going on, constant power changing dynamics. It says in 1909, a pledge was demanded and was to be signed before these masters would give the chiefs further and higher teachings. It pledged them to absolute belief in messages, teachings, and rituals given by these unknown beings. What could possibly go wrong there? So Now I'm going to give you probably the most disturbing part of their literature, which is the final part of the oath. Should I at any time find myself unable any longer to keep this pledge, I will say nothing to my brothers and sisters of the order to weaken their faith, but I will quietly pass into abeyance, which gives them a sort of way out of it. So we've had this horrifically channeled oath from the wife of MacGregor Mathers, who sounds like she was a bit of an actress and a good performer, especially during the Osiris ritual in the theatre in Paris. But these people, I don't think, were to be taken very seriously. It reminds me very much of these people who get involved in Gardnerian witchcraft. You know, the rest of the world sees these shriveled up old people naked with wreaths of flowers on their head, but they see it as the rebirth of the Oak King. You know, it is quite funny. There is, in fact, I know this occultist, and he went to Conway Hall, and he was meant to be the Oak King, and they're all stood in a circle in Conway Hall, and he was this asthmatic, and he couldn't even hear him. He says, "I relinquish my power for another year." It was brilliant. It was really, really funny. So yeah, clashes of egos, ideology shifting, no providence, no direct connection, egregorial control. So that's really what seemed to be going on. Further, the following shows how unsuspecting adepts are controlled and used by these masters. This was on May the 19th, 1902. In coming to thee, he came not of his own initiative, but in obedience to an impulse from the chiefs of the Third Order, who desired to use his aura as a vehicle for testing and examining thee. But this was wholly unknown to him, who was used unconsciously. Well, that says it all, doesn't it? That says it's an egregorial mind trap. And when they say things like that, they are extending their egos. But also, there's probably some truth in it, because people are getting possessed to go in a certain direction. So, same with all willing dupes, and oath seals their fate as they are the victims of their own actions. That's very, very important. It's all about consent. You have to consent to this stuff. Without consent, it doesn't work. Same with all black magic. It's all about consent. So the use of black magic within society goes into things like the blood bond at birth, you know, the Guthrie card, and now the DNA, the vitamin K test, where they take the baby's blood at birth. They stored it on a card. This started in 1962, but it's all comes out of the birth certificate, which is a blood bond. The birth certificate is a blood bond. I'm going to do a show on that, actually, because there's a lot of misinformation about that, but very interesting stuff I found out about that. And I'll probably put a show out very soon about it. In fact, I was going to do one about a week ago, but other things are getting in the way, but all of it's very productive. So about 1908, suddenly another astral teacher appeared, an Arab called Ara Ben Shemesh. He said on January 26, 1909, that he came from the temple in the desert. Bit vague, isn't it? And those who live there are the sons of fire. This is very like the Father RC story. Very much like when he was traveling around the Middle East, and he met all these Kabbalists and these people who had all this information that nobody ever talked about in public. You know, there are three ranks: neophytes, and the accepted and proven, and the indwellers. The indwellers we call masters. They live in personal communicum with the divine or the deified, and being no longer bound in the flesh, they are liberated. Their material life is entirely a matter of will. So long as they are required as teachers, so long may they continue to inhabit the earthly tabernacle. When they have completed their task, they have only to cease to will, and they will dematerialize. So they'll go off into the ether. So this is an interesting thing, because I think that people can dematerialize. I mean, having experienced the outer body experience and studied that, there is a lot in this stuff, but it has to be done under discipline, and you have to do it for the right reasons, really. But this is an interesting thing. Can people actually, what they call teleport, and be seen in different places at different times? I think that is possible. There's actually a lot of evidence of that. I was looking into it years ago. It's really interesting, that one. Let's get back to this. Christian Rosenkreutz came to us and learned. There you go. didn't even read that because I just copied it out to say to you. But yes, it sounds like the Father RC. So this is bullshit. This Arab bloke, this is complete garbage because the Father RC story is completely made up. From us, he took the letters Christian Rosenkreuz, CR. The true interpretation is one of the great mysteries of the universe. Yeah, it's one of the great mysteries of the universe because you made it up. Further, Christian Rosenkreuz, the mystical and perhaps holy mythical, yeah, definitely, head of Rosicrucians, was said to be contacted in the vault of RR and AC. And it was also said that he was to reincarnate about 1926 to 1933 by possessing himself of some adult body. Well, this is a little bit like the Maitreya, who was meant to be in the East End in the 80s. No one ever saw him. It's this Benjamin Creme that actually said this. The Maitreya's in, I think he was in East Ham or somewhere like that. It was in East Ham, the Maitreya. But he never showed himself. It's funny that, isn't it? We find these masters impersonating a Christ. This is what they do. They call it the soul of Christ with the cross of light and the red rose. It's about the resurrection of Lazarus. A symbol of what is expected of all adepts, thus controlled crucifixion through suffering and absolute sacrifice of their own individuality upon the cross of Illuminism, which is a very good way of putting it. That's again in conclusion in the book Enquire Within, which is 540 pages long, and it contains a lot of information about all of these different so-called secret societies, but they're all linked in a very interesting way as far as the control system goes. So let's see what Dr. Felkin said in 1916. In addition to Christian Rosenkreuz, there are certain members who still function on the material plane. Most of them are lead very secluded lives and can only be met after much difficulty has been overcome. Of course, because you've got to keep the mystery going, haven't you? The hamster wheel of promise is going nowhere. So Dr. Felkin, unfortunately, was another dupe in their hands. So the failure of the Kabbalists is no providence, ego-driven actions, acting above their ability. Can we see that happening in world politics at the moment? Absolutely. That's the failure of Kabbalah. No providence, ego-driven actions, acting above their ability, thinking that they are on a par with God, and even believing that they can win an argument with God, as in the Talmud. So the solution to deception is a natural state of being, which is so difficult to attain when we are put into so many mind traps. And it cannot be done through third parties. It has to be done directly. So it can't be done through organized religion. A natural state of being emits all of its information and the entirety of itself. It says what it does and does what it says. So that's very, very important. Visible in all aspects to all other objects. So once the real truth is out there, nothing is hidden, basically. Absorb information from the field. Wrong information is absorbed through lack of observational skill or wrong input. That's very, very important now. Wrong information is absorbed through lack of observational skill or wrong input. Some people use the word intuition. That intuition is often at the mercy of these egregorial mind traps. For instance, I've seen that so much in the New Age movement. They think someone's come along for a reason, and they try and attach meaning to things which are of not much importance or consequence. But if you've got a through line of action directed by divine providence, none of that would ever get mentioned. It would just be followed, because there'd be much more important things to discuss, such as goals and information, real information. So all of that stuff about this sort of fake magical thinking would disappear. So the highest governance, of course, God, the highest governance, and the misunderstanding of this leads just to deception and delusion. So the neurotic mind is present. As we've said in the book of Zohar, Simeon ben Yochai, aka Moses de Leon, 12th century, believe God is in 10 parts, but separate and not combined. Humans have a duty to help God to become one with all. What sort of crazy person would say that? Someone who doesn't understand nature, someone who cannot be in the unified field of life. That is somebody who's completely neurotic. Humans have a duty to help God to become one with all. Fails just at that point. God is incapable of assembling his own reality, in other words. That is just insane. Needs men who can do magic on earth to join the parts together on earth, which will be carried out on earth and in the heavens. That is the view of the Kabbalists in the Zohar. Needs men who can do magic on earth to join the parts together on earth, which will be carried out on earth and in the heavens. It hasn't worked out so good so far, has it? That's what you could call the elite mind trap. So yeah, hence the hexagram, the pentagram, the tetragrammaton, the names of God. So everything on earth and above is a synchronistic natural ecosystem. Yes, and we've got this argument with the Talmud that I've talked to you about. I don't need to go into that. So yes, I'm going to do a separate show on the spin-offs of these organizations, how they're still active today. And we've done a lot of shows previous to this, which really cover that sort of ground. The New Age, just go to winnersontheworld.net, put New Age in. It'll all come up. We've covered a lot of detail on this if you want to know more about the background of how it worked in this century. So yes, got through so much. Yes. So I'll miss those bits out because it's quite a long show, isn't it? Enjoyed it though. I've enjoyed this one because it's making me think as I go along. The idea with this is that it brings information into my mind as I'm going along. So I'll make notes and I know where I'm going with it, but I end up coming out knowing more than I did at the beginning. So I'm learning as well. It's like a lifelong learning progress. So conclusion, yeah. Those that have an understanding of the true nature of the world and its governing principles under the highest governance or God have a duty to redress the balance the books and derail the usurpers at every opportunity. And philosophically, that will naturally happen if you're in divine providence. It's an interesting thing. These obstacles that came into my path for many, many years were actually big lessons, and not in a kind of new age way, but there was a reason for them to happen. There was an absolute reason. I remember years ago, a friend of mine said, well, the reason you're going to court with these people all the time is it's your job to teach them a lesson. And I said, well, that's actually what I'm thinking in the back of my head. It wasn't about winning the court case. It was about teaching them a lesson because they needed to be taught something. So once you start thinking like that, I think providence increases in life as well. And you get onto the right track. And it stops the discord within personalities. And I can see through people a lot quicker through all this. And I hope it works for you too. It's a fascinating thing. I've shed so many people, not just since 2020, but starting to refine this stuff means that every part of your life is refined, which is the opposite of what we've been talking about during the show. These people were just going from their egos and channeling stuff, and none of it's reliable, and none of it actually achieves anything. None of these people actually achieved anything with what they were doing. I can't say that they didn't learn anything from it. But when you look at the real versus the stated goals, the dupes who are put in front within these secret societies and organizations and what they're really for, then that's all you need to know. So that was what I was looking at over the past week or two. And what I've just talked about is the real illumination, thinking outside the box, outside of mind traps, outside, of course, terrible oaths, ritual, and egregorial group think. And I hope that was useful. I'll be putting up more shows over the next couple of days. Actually, I've got some stuff to upload. Do support the show if you can. Go to windowsontheworld.net. You can help me out. You can join the £5 a month club. I do have a lot of expenses, and I want to keep putting out the information. The films and the information I put out are all public, and everything on the website is free. So do think of supporting the show, and do stay in touch through the website, info@windowsontheworld.net. So thanks a lot. I'm going to have a look at the comments, and hopefully this will be more regular from now on. But when I'm not actually on air, I'm working on something. So that's the way it goes. I'll never just come on and just waffle, because there's far too much of that around, isn't there? Okay, thanks a lot, everybody. I'm going to have a look at the comments, which look great.